This is Common Ground with me, Sonja Wolf, and with me today to talk about immigration policing in the United States is César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández. He's a professor of law at Ohio State University, where he also holds the Gregory Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. César writes and teaches about the intersection of criminal and immigration law, and he has authored a number of books. One of these works is titled Welcome the Wretched, in defense of the criminal alien, and it's the basis for our conversation today. Welcome to the podcast, César.
Thank you very much, Sonja. I'm happy to be here.
President Trump likes to argue that unauthorized migrants are criminals and must be deported from the United States. In your book, you argue that migration should never be criminalized and that evidence of crime should not help decide who can remain in the United States and who cannot. And related to this argument, you make two further claims. One is that migrants are a product of their time in the United States and that migrants are ordinary people. Could you explain what you mean when you state this?
Sure. Well, what I mean when I say migrants are a product of the time is I think that we often hear politicians describe migrants as being sort of fully formed somewhere else, and then they come to the United States, or to whatever the receiving country is. Well, maybe that's to work, and maybe that's because of fleeing violence or fleeing persecution. But whatever the motive, whatever the reason for them to leave their country of origin, they do so after having fully developed. And what we see in the United States and in particular is that of course migrants come here quite often at a very young age and are formed molded into the people that they become in the context of life in the United States, with all of its opportunity, but also with all of its constraints. And so I write about folks like Winnie Goodwin, who, when she was a teenager, was driving a car in which a couple of friends of hers were armed, had a gun, and they shot at a couple of kids who they saw walking out of a restaurant, kids who they knew, kids who they obviously did not like. Winnie was eventually convicted of a couple of counts of attempted murder. Fortunately, neither of the two people who were shot at was actually killed. Winnie was sentenced to prison time in California, and when she was finishing up that prison sentence, immigration officials were waiting for her to try to deport her. At the time, she was born in Vietnam, but at the time, Winnie had spent all of her life in the United States except for maybe the first month of her life. She was taken out of Vietnam. This was sort of the end of the U.S. Military entanglement in Vietnam. She was taken out as a newborn onto her family's fishing boat, and then brought to the United States, as were many other folks who were fleeing Vietnam at the time, because they had sided with the United States, as had her father, who was in the military. And so Winnie was not born in the United States. She was very much raised in the United States. She was very much acculturated in the United States, and in the particular urban environment of the 1980s and early 1990s, in which gangs were blossoming in California, in Southern California, where she was living with her family, and in a country in which guns are not hard to come by. And as a result, no surprise that the violence or the crime that she committed was a gang-related violent crime. And yet, the way that we talk about migrants is as if they had come from someplace else already, sort of with this intent to harm communities in the United States, when in reality they're being very much formed by these communities in the United States. And as a result, I think we have to take into account that these are very much ordinary people who are very much influenced by the same pressures, the same economic pressures, the same social pressures, the same lack of a strong social safety net that anyone who's born in the United States also has to grapple with. And some of us are able to navigate that environment free of encounters from the criminal legal system, and others aren't. But it has very little to do with our citizenship status and or where we were born, and everything to do with just sort of the environmental support that we have from our families and from the communities in which we live.
I think many people who follow developments in the United States would concur that immigration law and policy are driven by politics. That is to say, whenever politicians identify a problem, the answer is police, prosecutors, and prisons. And you show throughout the history of the United States that often these are the preferred answers. So I would like to turn to immigration law. And again, to step back a little bit into history. People might think that immigration law and criminal law are two separate fields of law, but we see nowadays in the United States that this is no longer the case. How did this fusion, perhaps, or this intersection between immigration law and criminal law come about?
Yeah, we think of and we study, in fact, and we talk about law in the United States as existing in these separate silos. There's criminal law, and then there's immigration law, and there's the other versions of law, there's constitutional law here, and there's other forms of law. But beginning in more or less in the middle of the 1980s, we started to see that the Reagan administration started working very closely with Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, to entangle criminal law and immigration law, so that Congress started to enact a series of laws in which it became much easier to fall into immigration law problems because of some criminal activity. That was relatively new for most of the history of the United States. Somebody committed a crime. Maybe they would have problems with the police. Oftentimes, obviously, crime is not investigated. But when it is, they might have problems with the police. They might be prosecuted, and if they are convicted, then they're sentenced to some punishment. But for most of the history of the United States, that was the end of the story. And that was true for U.S. citizens, as it was true for people who were not U.S. citizens. So I write about one individual named Louis Loftus Foulier. He lived in New York City about a century ago, who one day in 1939 kills his son. He suffocates his son to death. And he's not a U.S. citizen. The judge sentences, he's convicted. The judge sentences him to some prison time, serves that prison time, then he eventually becomes a U.S. citizen. He goes through the naturalization process. He actually goes through it twice because of the fact that the first time he just didn't wait long enough. And so there's a legal judicial opinions in which one of the most influential judges in the history of the United States, a man named Judge Billings Learned Hand, he says, well, this crime that he committed it. Yes, he says we can't undo that, but this crime should not be the reason that we keep him out of the ranks of the citizenry. I'm paraphrasing here. I write in more detail, more specifically in the book about this, right? But to think that these days, right, talking in 2025, there's somebody who is convicted of killing his own child, right? The judge would say, "Oh, well, that's not a big deal. That's at least not a big enough deal to keep you from becoming a U.S. citizen." Right? It is unimaginable to those of us who are alive in 2025 and thinking and familiar with immigration law, or even not familiar with immigration law, right? That a court would come to that conclusion. So the judge says, "Look, and the reason that the problem here is that you didn't wait long enough. You needed to have waited 5 years. You waited 4 months, 4 years, 11 months, and 1 week. Had you just waited 3 more weeks, we wouldn't even have this debate. So how about you start over?" So that's what Louis Loftus Foulier does. He goes back. He goes back to his job. He goes back to his family, the ones who he hasn't killed. And then he applies for naturalization again. And the second time around, he becomes a U.S. citizen. Right. So that's sort of the history of the United States. But beginning in 1980, the Reagan administration is trying to figure out, okay, how do we win back the support of all of these white people who had these very openly racist views, and who have been silenced by developments in the 1960s and the 1970s that have made it absolutely clear that culturally it's no longer permissible to explicitly vocalize racist sentiments. But they still feel those things. Right? They still don't like Black people. They still don't like Mexicans. Right? That's sort of the primary immigrant group at the time. And so the Reagan administration says, like, well, we know we can't just go around saying openly racist things about Black people or about Mexicans. So how about we just call them all criminals? And we say, well, we are going to go after the criminals. And that means we get to go after the young Black men in urban areas, right, who are engaged in illicit drug activity, except we have to create that whole body of law because it wasn't illegal, with a few exceptions. The federal government wasn't in the business of policing drug activity prior to the middle of the 1980s. We also have to start targeting all of these folks who are coming from Latin America. So yes, there's the Mexicans. There's also, in the 1980s, there's also a whole bunch of Central Americans who are coming to the United States. They're fleeing the violence that's racking that region in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala. And they're making their way to the United States. Some of them are fleeing governments that the Reagan administration supports in places like Nicaragua. Why are you fleeing them? Oh, it's because you're a radical leftist. You're a communist. You might be a Soviet spy. And so Reagan actually talks about these folks as being sort of the tip of the spear of Soviet influence. And as a result of their supposed leftist political beliefs, we should be afraid of them. The United States should be afraid of them, and we ought to keep them out. And so those two dynamics then convince Congress to start to both, on the one hand, build up what we now refer to as the war on drugs, the federal legislation that is the war on drugs. At the same time, increase the power that the federal government has to exclude migrants who are coming from Latin America and to detain and deport migrants who make it here, and then who have who make it here without the federal government's permission, or who make it here with the federal government's permission, and then eventually interact with the police and have some kind of criminal law blemish on their records.
In your book, you point out that in the criminal legal system, there is already racial bias. Why is it problematic, therefore, when immigration law and criminal law intersect?
Well, because if we're building immigration law decision making apparatus, if we're deciding who gets who come into the United States or remain in the United States, which is the essential function of immigration law, by tapping the outcome of a criminal legal system, criminal legal process, then either we are embracing all of the flaws of the criminal legal process that result in that outcome, or we're ignoring it. Right? We're sticking our heads in the sand and saying, "Oh, let's just pretend that it doesn't exist." And I think one of the things that we see in immigration law is a whole lot of ignoring of the many flaws that exist with the criminal legal system. Yeah, I'm somebody who spent most of his adult life on college campuses, right? And every college campus in the United States that I've ever spent any meaningful amount of time on has crime problems. And some of that is the kind of stuff that is sort of laughable, right? It's like low-level marijuana possession, low-level marijuana use. Underage drinking is a really big problem. Binge drinking in the United States is a really big problem by young people who are not allowed to purchase or consume alcohol. But some of the crime is not anything to be shrugged off. It's violent crime. It's sexual abuse. It's rape. Something like a third of women, female undergraduates, end their time on college campuses with a bachelor's degree and an experience of sexual violence. Right? That is not something to laugh at. That's not something to dismiss. That is an epidemic across college campuses in the United States that we know to be true. And yet I have never once walked across a college campus and heard anyone say, "There goes the criminal undergraduate." Somebody is committing these crimes. Somebody is committing these rapes. Somebody is committing these acts of sexual violence, right? And the reason why no one is pegging these undergraduates as being beyond rehabilitation is because they're engaging. They're performing their worst moments. They're living their worst moments in privileged spaces, in wealthy, predominantly white spaces, right? In which we understand culturally that they are young and in the process of maturing, and that they will make mistakes, and that it's the job of the rest of us to support them into becoming the better versions of themselves that they are capable of becoming. Well, immigration law takes the exact opposite approach. It says we will peg you, we will tie you to that worst moment, no matter when it comes, and we will not give you the opportunity to rehabilitate, nor will we give you the support that you need to become that better version of yourself, nor will we even take into account that maybe you already became that better version of yourself because so much time has passed. All we will do is look at that worst moment, and if we can peg you to it, we will, and that will be enough to detain you and to deport you, and that is the end of the story.
A few moments ago, you started painting a picture of developments in the United States in the 1980s and lawmaking in terms of immigration and the criminal legal system. But the criminalization of migration activity started much earlier. If we can mention perhaps one figure, it is Coleman Bleeth.
Okay.
Who was this person and what has been his influence on immigration law?
So Coleman Bleeth was a politician in South Carolina during the strongest moment of Jim Crow, and those anti-black codes and customs that were trying to replicate the pre-Civil War social dynamic. And Coleman Bleeth was somebody who understood how to rally racist sentiment among his white working class base to propel him into higher and higher office. And so he goes from being a member of the state legislature to being the governor of South Carolina, and eventually a United States senator. And Coleman Bleeth, when he finally gets to the U.S. Senate, teams up with a number of other anti-immigrant, xenophobic politicians, including a man named Albert Johnson, who's a member of the House of Representatives from Washington, the state of Washington, and who was a big proponent of eugenics. Eugenics as pseudoscience, right, of eugenics, and as the chairman of the House Committee on Immigration, Albert Johnson regularly has invites testimony from prominent eugenicists, including a guy named Harry Laughlin, is probably the most prominent eugenicist in the United States at that time. And so Coleman Bleeth is trying to figure out, well, how do I make myself into a prominent figure? He wants to have an impact, and he wants to be remembered. So he finally lands on this idea that immigration may be the way for him to do it. In the early 1920s, Congress has already enacted some pretty strict immigration laws that are trying to replicate the racial composition of the U.S. population as it existed at the end of the 1800s. And the one big exception to that had been Mexicans, specifically Mexicans, because agribusiness it was just too strong. There were just too many powerful corporate interests in the Southwest, primarily places like California and Texas. It just relied too heavily on a constant flow of Mexicans who were coming and going from the United States to do the hard manual labor that was required in order to build up these agricultural industries that eventually throughout the 20th century were the key components of the economy, so places like Texas and California. And so they had managed to be able to muster enough votes to block restrictionist immigration legislation in Congress that would target Mexicans specifically. Well, Belize comes around and says, "Well, we're not going to target Mexicans. We're gonna target criminals. We're gonna make it so that we can get rid of people who commit a crime. Well, we need a crime first. And if you want to target criminals, first you have to create the crime. And so that's where they land upon this idea that they will criminalize entering the United States without the federal government's permission. Now, this is the early 20th century. The U.S.-Mexican border, the border patrol is pretty much irrelevant. There are communities that span the border. In some places, like in Nogales, Arizona, and Sonora, there are literally buildings that are on the literal border, right? And so, like the international boundary, yes, it's a boundary, but it's not really a border in the way that we think of it today. The Border Patrol itself is created in 1924, right? So it's tiny at the time. People are coming and going, right? Mostly not at a port of entry. Mostly they're not stopping and being inspected and then admitted into the United States. And so Belize and his allies in Congress said, well, look, you do that, that's a crime. You can be punished. You can be prosecuted. You can be punished for doing that and sentenced to federal prison. After which, they can get deported. And so they managed to go to carry this banner of criminalizing migration through the legislative process, in that way outmaneuver those corporate interests that had previously blocked enactment of any kind of legislation that would target Mexicans specifically. And that law that Belize spearheads to Congress in 1929 is more or less still on the books today. It's the laws that we often refer to as legal entry, which is punishable by federal prosecutors, and illegal re-entry, which basically means coming into the United States without the federal government's permission after having previously been deported. And since the end of the administration of George W. Bush, together these crimes have been among the most heavily prosecuted crimes in the federal court system nationwide. But it really did take about 80 years before these crimes really caught on. So they were on the books. They were formally available to prosecutors, but prosecutors didn't really use them. If people were in the United States in violation of immigration law, they might get deported, they might not. But that's a civil process, not a criminal process. And prosecutors basically take the position: we have a finite number of dollars to spend on our lawyers and our investigators. We're going to go after other people. We're not going to go after these ordinary migrants who are coming to the United States to work on farms and in construction.
Could you, for a moment, take us to an immigration court? Because I think for people who have not been able to observe immigration proceedings, it might be difficult to comprehend what is happening inside an immigration court, especially in the border states, where what is happening might be called a massification of immigration proceedings. What is happening in a courtroom?
Yeah, so immigration courts, the first thing to keep in mind about immigration courts is that they're not real courts in the way that we think of of courts as being independent. They're not part of the federal court system that's created by the Constitution. The judges who preside over these hearings are not nominated by the president and appointed by the Senate. Instead, the immigration court system is a component of the Justice Department. And the head of the Justice Department is the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is, of course, a political appointee. And as a result, immigration judges themselves operate under constraints that are imposed by political appointees. But not just the Attorney General, but the high-level deputy Attorney Generals are also political appointees. And those are the folks who set direction, the policy direction for the immigration court system. And those directives are then supposed to be implemented by the individual immigration judges. And so we see time and time again that immigration judges really are had to have their day-to-day goals, work goals, impacted by whatever the political prerogatives are of the presidential administration that is at the time occupying the White House. It's less rare, although it has happened, and it has happened very recently since Donald Trump has returned to the Oval Office, that we've seen mass firings of immigration judges who the political appointees believe do not have the political objectives of the administration in mind. And that's just the clearest reflection of the lack of impartiality, the lack of independence that the immigration court systems reflect on a daily basis. Though what we see in the immigration courts is that people are being charged by lawyers who work for the federal government with being in the United States in violation of immigration law. Maybe that's because they came to the United States without federal government permission. Maybe they came here and they have some kind of visa, or they have their lawful permanent residence, but they did something else, right? That the federal government's lawyers think put them in violation of immigration law and make them removable. And on the other end of the room, there's a migrant who is oftentimes standing there by themselves. There is a right to hire a lawyer to represent you in immigration court, but there is no right to have a lawyer appointed to represent you if you are unable to afford one, or if you simply can't find an immigration lawyer to work on your behalf. One of the things that we see over and over again is that the network of immigration prisons that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency operates, the largest of these facilities are in very, very rural places, in the middle of the Sonora Desert, between Phoenix and Tucson, for example, and places like Florence and Eloy, Arizona. These are just prison towns. There are hardly any people there, nonetheless, any lawyers. And fewer still immigration lawyers. So you have folks coming from Phoenix, and you have folks who sometimes come from Tucson, right? But that's a handful of lawyers for facilities that every day are housing 1,500 or 2,000 people. And as a result, most folks who are detained while they're going through the immigration court process, they don't have legal representation. So they're required to put up a legal fight against the trained prosecutor by themselves. And that's true of adults who are mentally competent It's true of adults who have only been in the United States a few days and may not speak English. And it's also true of children, because children are also being put to the immigration court system. And children also do not have a right to appointed counsel. And so we see that immigration courts produce outcomes on a daily basis. But when the outcome is the end result of a process in which one party, the federal government, is represented by a trained lawyer, and the other party is very routinely standing there on their own, effectively with their hands tied behind their backs and their eyes blindfolded, then the legitimacy of that outcome is doubtful.
You talked about how illegal entry and illegal re-entry came to be on the books, and I'd like to take a closer look at the construction of migrant criminality now. So you've already painted a picture of what was happening in the 1980s and 1990s. Gang violence in California became more visible. President Reagan declared a war on drugs. And I'd like to ask you about some additional laws that helped make people deportable. So in the legal arena, what else was happening at the time?
Right. So the 1980s is when this entanglement between criminal law and immigration law begins under the Reagan administration, but it doesn't end there. It certainly continues under Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, who signed the Immigration Act of 1990. And when he signed the Immigration Act of 1990, he said, "This is a key feature of my administration's policy to counter drug activity." Again, I'm paraphrasing here, but what we see here this seamless relationship confluence of immigration law and illicit drug activity, in which the president, as he signs a law that is called the Immigration Act of 1990, is talking about how it's supposed to be a key feature of his anti-drug policy. Right? Fast forward to the middle of the 1990s, and now we have a Democrat in the White House, Bill Clinton, who is very keen to take away from Republicans their winning electoral strategy, which is to say, the Democrats are soft on crimes. Republicans, we go after criminals. We go after folks who are in gangs in places like LA, famously the Massachusetts governor or the Massachusetts the Democratic candidate for president, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. George Bush goes after him and says, "Look, you released this guy from prison, and he went out and killed this couple, this husband and wife pair, and there's all of these images on political advertisements of the released inmate, a guy named Willie Horton, black man, and the two white people who were killed." And as you see, this political ad campaign the Republicans release that has this menacing look of menacing photograph of Willie Horton and innocent youngish white couple who he killed. Right? And so that lesson is one that Bill Clinton learns as governor, and he uses it quite effectively when he is going up against the incumbent President George H.W. Bush, and he says, "I'm tough
on crime. I have been tough on crime in the state of Arkansas, and I will be tough on crime. And in fact, when he does win the White House, he does his supporters in Congress do come through. In 1995, there's a sort of catalyzing moment in the United States that then leads to some pretty significant legislative enactments. And that moment is the bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City. Immediately, prominent members of Congress blame Arab migrants. Turns out they were absolutely wrong. It was two white men, right-wing, former military white men who blew up the federal building. I forget how many people they killed. It was a lot, including a daycare center full of children. But Congress then in 1996 enacts a couple of laws, one called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, and the second is called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, EDPA and IRA. And together, these laws, various parts of these laws, have the effect of making it easier to fall into the immigration detention and deportation pipeline, and a lot harder to get out. So they expand the number of crimes for which it is possible to get detained. In fact, for which it is required that they be detained. They constrain the power that immigration judges had to look at a person's whole life history and say, okay, yes, you did commit this crime. And that's bad. Also, your father. Also, that was 15 years ago. You've been helping all these other folks in your community. Also, you've avoided any other problems since then. Right? And instead, they end up taking those powers away from immigration judges. They take powers that similar power that federal judges had to say, okay, we're going to sentence you. I'm going to sentence you some jail time because you committed a crime, but I don't want this jail time, this punishment, to mean permanent separation from your family, mean permanent exile from the place that in which you have been making a life, imperfect as that life may be. And Congress has took those powers away from federal judges as well. And the collective, the cumulative effort, result of this effort is that it becomes a lot easier for migrants to find themselves in immigration law problems, and it makes it a lot harder for them to get out of those problems, to fix to remain living in the United States lawfully once they got into those immigration law problems. And that happens courtesy of a bipartisan effort by Republicans in Congress, along with key Democrats in Congress, working with folks in the Democratic-controlled White House.
So we now have the aggravated felony that has been added to immigration law. And we should probably also mention that the Illegal Immigration Reform and the Immigrant Responsibility Act also impacted the relationship between federal immigration officials and local police and sheriff's departments. This is something we'll come back to in a moment. But one term I would like to turn to first, because it's something we constantly hear, is the idea of the criminal alien. Why is this term being used, and how does it again relate to the racism that is embedded in the immigration system?
Well, I think it's a useful term to describe everyone and anyone who is supposedly a danger. And so it starts off. We see in the past several decades that politicians will use it as a way to describe migrants who have committed a crime, right? And it really this reference to an alien, and a criminal alien specifically, is that this person is an outsider. It's a foreigner. It's some entity that is different from those of us who are already here. And not only that, they are a criminal. So they're a dangerous version of that outsider. And more recently, under the leadership of President Trump, we see that whatever boundaries existed there before, whatever outer limits existed before, to the way in which politicians use this phrase, they're gone.
Right? And so the White House press secretary recently said, well, we think everyone who's violating immigration laws is a criminal. Right? And that's why every time we fill a bus or we fill an airplane with migrants who we're removing from the United States, we're going to say, look, there go a bunch of criminals, right? Because they've all violated immigration law in one way or another. So this concept, right? It takes the humanity out of the person, right? But it also just has no. It's endless. It's endlessly malleable. It can be molded to whatever the political goal is of the moment, and that is, I think, its true danger. Right? That there are no fixed limits. There is no definition that will stick from year to year, and so we could all say, well, we all agree on what this is. We can't agree on what this is. And I think it's born of the fact that in immigration law, ever since it started to embrace criminal law as the primary metric by which to decide who gets to live in the United States and who doesn't, we see these terms that are introduced into immigration law, and whatever definition they have at that moment, at the initial entry point, gets broader and broader and broader, so that we have concepts like moral turpitude. What does moral turpitude mean? It means inherently base, vile, or depraved, according to the immigration courts. Who can agree on what's inherently base, vile, or depraved? Right? You go to Denver, where I live, and marijuana is literally being sold on the corner right now. Right? You walk into the store, and it's legal in Colorado. Right? You use your credit card. Right? You walk out, there's no shame. Right? You go to Kansas, right? And that's a state crime and a federal crime. So we can't agree on what's inherently base, vile, or depraved. This concept of aggravated felony, it's added to immigration law in 1988. It means rape. It means trafficking in firearms, trafficking in drugs. Okay, all bad things, right? That's in 1988. Today, it means that. It means forging a passport. It means having tax problems. It means jumping the turnstile into the New York City subway system. You don't pay your fare to get into the subway. I mean, it means all kinds of things that to most people don't sound like a felony in the United States. That's the worst kind of crime. And an aggravated felony, that sounds like the worst kind of crime. Not paying to ride the subway. It's not a far-fetched thing to say. Most people don't think of that. Maybe most people think, okay, don't do that. Most people don't think that that's the worst kind of crime that we can imagine. And yet Congress gets to define these terms however it wants. And so it does.
Let's move on from immigration law to immigration enforcement. The Department of Homeland Security was created in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. In terms of immigration, what does the Department of Homeland Security do, and how powerful is it nowadays?
The Department of Homeland Security is sort of like an adolescent, right? It's growing up. It's grown up in the last 20 years. And like many 20-year-olds, it's trying to figure out who it's going to become. But it's relying on sort of this macho attitude, this sort of brute force attitude, that right is what it can do. And so across the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security is now the second largest federal government unit, second only to the Department of Defense, so to the military. Across the federal government, the immigration law enforcement parts of the Department of Homeland Security, remember DHS also does things like airport security, right? So the immigration parts of it are Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency and the Customs and Border Protection Division, which houses the Border Patrol. Those units
get more funding from Congress than all of the other federal law enforcement agencies combined. So if you add up the budgets for the Department for the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, for the FBI, for the Secret Service, for the U.S. Marshal Service, it is overwhelmed by the amount of funding the ICE and CBP get. And with that money comes an enormous amount of power. So at the border, CBP folks staff the ports of entry, and the Border Patrol is responsible for enforcing immigration law between ports of entry. In the nation's interior, those responsibilities fall on the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. And with their very generous funding, CBP and ICE regularly develop close relationships with third-party private companies that allow them to augment their ability to surveil, detain, and remove migrants, whether it's migrants who are arriving at the border or folks who are already in the United States. So ICE runs a network of hundreds of immigration prisons throughout the United States, almost all of which are not operated by ICE. They're operated under contract with ICE. Most of these facilities are actually just county jails that are run by a sheriff's department, and from which ICE essentially just rents bed space under a contract with the county sheriff. That's the majority of the ICE prison facilities. The largest of the ICE prison facilities are actually not that. They're standalone facilities that are owned or operated by private prison companies. Companies like Core Civic or the Geo Group. Those are the two largest of the private prison corporations that operate in the United States. So they're not alone. And these companies charge ICE a fixed amount per day, per person, or per bed that they're using. And most of these contracts actually have a daily minimum to guarantee that ICE will pay a certain amount of money every single day, whether or not that space is being used. Now, what we've seen most of the last few presidential administrations is that ICE tends to use most of its bed space day in and day out. The one big exception to that was actually the very end of the Trump administration, and into the very beginning of the Biden administration, because of the effect that COVID had and the pandemic had on ICE's ability to keep filling those beds. But by the time Biden left the White House, there were about 39,000 people who were being held by ICE. ICE at that point had a capacity of about 43,000 people, and right now what we're seeing is that ICE is increasing its capacity, and so we've seen an increase of the number of people who ICE is holding and or are being held on behalf of ICE by private prison companies, and we can expect to see that increase as long as Congress is willing to continue providing more funding for ICE and for CBP, and mostly Congress has been willing to do that ever since the Department of Homeland Security was created back in 2001.
How does ICE collaborate with police departments?
Well, ICE certainly well-funded and has a lot of agents throughout the United States, but it is tiny in comparison to the collective presence of local law enforcement agencies, municipal police departments, and county sheriff's departments. And as a result, ICE doesn't have to, but ICE likes to partner with those local law enforcement agencies. And one of the ways that this happens is by sharing access to information
information, to computer databases. And so through agreements called 287G agreements, which is 287G is just the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act in which this power is housed. ICE enters into agreements with sheriff's departments and police departments to essentially deputize those local police officers to act as ICE agents. That is, when they book somebody into a county jail or into or run across somebody when local police officers are out and about doing their jobs, they can enter the identification of a particular person into a computer system that is tied to Department of Homeland Security's electronic databases. And that helps to identify people who might be in the United States in violation of immigration law. Certainly that's true for folks who have entered the United States, want some kind of visa to be here temporarily, and then several years later they're still here. And so this 287G agreement are a very sort of streamlined, very seamless system through which ICE essentially augments its power by relying on local police officers who are paid by local governments. And that money obviously comes from local taxpayers. And once somebody who is in local police custody is flagged as being in the United States potentially in violation of immigration law, that ICE can decide whether they are going to come and pick that person up. So they'll issue what's called a detainer, which is basically a notice saying, "Hey, we're interested in this person. Could you let us know before you release them?" And most Republican-led jurisdictions willingly do that. And many of the largest cities in the United States, which are controlled by Democrats, are very reluctant to do that. In part because, of course, people get booked into jails all the time and then released because actually they didn't commit a crime, or because they did something and it's just not worth the effort for prosecutors to actually pursue that crime because it's a low-level offense. Or in other instances, local elected officials in big cities don't want to violate the Constitution. And the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution actually says quite clearly, the Supreme Court is quite clear on this, that the police cannot hold somebody just because they want to. There has to be actual evidence that they've done something, that they've committed a crime, and violating immigration law is not a crime in the way that most people violate it by having done something to flout immigration law, and as a result, lots of jurisdictions that are held by Democrats are very reluctant, and sometimes they have laws or policies that explicitly prohibit complying with detainers, because courts have been quite clear that that puts them at risk of liability, and they might ultimately have to pay some money for violating the Constitution.
Let's look at citizenship and visas. So far, I think our conversation has focused on migrant criminality. Politicians, generally, when they talk about migrant criminality, they want to sound tough, but there are exceptions to the rule. And I suspect this is something that may come up now that Prince Harry is in the news again, who at least one think tank believes may have been untruthful in his own visa application. So I wanted to ask you how race impacts who can stay in the United States, specifically when we look at visas and citizenship.
Yeah, Prince Henry is only the latest Brit to be in the headlines for immigration law problems. John Lennon was the other one decades ago, because got some of these conversations started well before my time But to your question about race and how that fits into the story, look, there are really two big ways of violating immigration law. One is you come to the United States without the government's permission, right? Then, thanks to Coleman Blease, that's a federal crime. You can be punished for that. And in fact, thousands of people are prosecuted for that every single day now. And you can be deported for that as well. The other way is you come to the United States with the federal government's permission, and then you're supposed to leave after 180 days, or after you finish school, or whatever the restrictions on a visa are. And it turns out you don't leave, and that results in it can result in deportation, but not criminal prosecution. And so one of these forms, the form that is criminalized, is primarily committed by people of color, especially migrants from Latin America, Mexicans, and increasingly Central and South Americans. Although that's still fairly new. And the other version, the second version, is committed every single day by Brits and Italians and Canadians and Australians, Western Europeans, and other folks from primarily white countries who can come to the United States relatively easily because they don't need a visa to come here. They need a passport, and then they need bus fare if you're Canadian, or an airplane ticket if you're coming from overseas. And the federal government knows that this is happening every single year. In fact, the federal government puts out a report about its estimate of what this is called overstaying a visa. And the federal government says, we know that there are over 100,000 people from Western European countries, Australia, Canada, who are coming to the United States every single year, and then they violate the terms by not leaving. And yet, we do not see that ICE's prison system is filled by Canadians and Brits and Germans and Italians, right? And we could fill those prison systems. The political backlash would be intense. I think that's why we don't do it. Every single time you hear about a German, right, or a Canadian who's been detained, it makes national news. And yet, violating immigration law by overstaying a visa as a formal legal matter, it's exactly the same as violating immigration law by walking across the Sonora Desert, right, from Sonora into Arizona. Exactly the same, right? They can both result in detention by ICE and deportation, right? And yet we see that the enforcement efforts are focused on the U.S.-Mexican border. We see that the folks who are detained in ICE's prison system are primarily Mexicans and other folks from Latin America. And we see that the vilification of migrants, the demonization of migrants, is always focused on people of color. You have folks like Jose Garcia Zarate, right, who stumbled across a pile of rags in the Embarcadero in San Francisco, right? And he reached down for it. The guy who was living on the street, he reached down for it without knowing what was in it, what it contained. And it turned out it had a gun, because the guns are everywhere in this country. There was a gun there, and the gun blasted a bullet, and a bullet ricocheted, and it hit a young woman named Kate Steinle, who was out for a walk with her father. And President Trump, or Donald Trump, when he was campaigning the first time for the White House, he made this into a prominent feature of his campaign. And when he accepted the Republican nomination for president, he talked about Kate Steinle repeatedly on that mega stage. Right? And he described Jose Garcia Zarate as a fiend. Right? And prominent Democratic politicians like Hillary Clinton and Dianne Feinstein, they criticized San Francisco and said this guy should never have been on those streets of San Francisco. Well, a jury acquitted him. A jury that actually looked at the evidence and said, yeah, there was a gun in that pile of rags, but there's no evidence that this guy knew that there was a gun in that pile of rags until the bullet went out of the barrel. He was just a homeless guy who found a pile of rags and reached down, and it turned out really poorly. We can all agree on that. Well, Jose Garcia Zarate was prosecuted and acquitted by a jury, and yet when that jury came out with its conclusion, Donald Trump, who by that point was president, he goes out onto the White House lawn and he records a video and he says, "Not only is this guy a bad guy, a jury is too." I not for once stopping to consider the fact that in a nation full of guns, kind of thing happens. In a nation in which mentally ill people don't get treatment, sometimes they make bad decisions. In a nation in which housing affordability is increasingly problematic, there are people who are living on the streets every single day. And yet when a Canadian broke into Nancy Pelosi's house, tried to kill her, and instead took a hammer to her husband's head, no one ever said, well, Canadians are just evil. We have to be deporting Canadians left and right. Now, that guy was arrested. He was punished. The fact that he's a Canadian citizen never comes up. And that's because there's the political climate of immigration policy in the United States such that we have turned migrants from Latin America primarily, but from other parts of the world in which people are primarily racialized as being not white, into the picture of dangerousness, and to that dangerousness, Congress is repeatedly willing to give the federal immigration law enforcement agencies more legal authority and more money to surveil, to detain, and deport, and would pay very little attention to the impact that has on the communities around them. Because, of course, people don't come to the United States randomly. They come to the United States because of the long history of ties between people in this country and people in other countries. And sometimes those are among the most meaningful ties, and immigration law enforcement policies threaten to tear those apart, and in fact do tear those apart on a daily basis.
You argue against the use of the criminal legal system to identify people to imprison and deport. What are some of the alternatives to current immigration enforcement that you propose?
Yeah, I think we should just remove the focus on criminality, and instead ask, are people who are here or who are coming here contributing to all of the things that make this such a vibrant place in which to live? Are they contributing to the economy? Maybe through labor market participation, maybe through investment. Are they contributing to the cultural vitality of the place? Like I write about another Canadian named Justin Bieber. I don't like his music, but plenty of other people do. Right? I'd say he's contributing to the nation's cultural wealth. Are they contributing to sort of those bonds that make life in the United States, like in any other place, meaningful? It is. Do they have? Are they parts of families? Are they parts of social networks? Are they engaged with community organizations to make the democratic spirit of this country, to breathe life into the democratic spirit of this country? And we see that migrants over and over again are parts of labor unions. They're parts of churches. They're involved with religious organizations. They're involved. They volunteer at their kids' schools. And those are the kinds of daily activities, mundane daily activities, that actually are the most meaningful to the economic vitality of this country, to the cultural vitality of this country, and to the democratic self-governance that is essential to this country, at least in my view, and I hope in the view of many others.
At the beginning of this episode, we mentioned that migrants are ordinary people. So the final question I would like to pose to you is the following. If it's necessary, as you say, to reimagine migrants as ordinary people, how can we embark on this reimagination in current times when Donald Trump is back in the White House?
I think this is actually the best moment to do that, because there's so many instances in which we see already in the first 2 months of the Trump administration that they describe migrants as being this exceptionally horrid people, these villains, the worst of the worst, to quote one official in Guantanamo. This week, the White House press secretary described these folks who were sent to El Salvador as horrible murderers, and yet we see that they make these claims without evidence, or at least without a willingness to show any evidence. And when anyone peeks behind the curtain, we see that oftentimes these claims are not built on anything that resembles reality. And so I think this is actually the best moment in which to remind ourselves that all of us are just a constellation of good and bad. We are folks who aspire to do well by the people around us, and most of the time we do, and sometimes we don't. And some of us are good, have the good fortune that our worst moments are committed in privileged spaces, those college students who do engage in violence but get away with it. And others of us are just fortunate enough that our worst moments are revealed to the people who care about us most deeply, and therefore want us to become the better versions of ourselves that we are capable of being. And what I want and what I hope happens is, as immigration law evolves, because I know that it will evolve in the United States, because it always has evolved, is that we take a look into our own lives and see not only the extraordinary moments of our own lives, the very ordinary moments, those moments in which we fail not only the people around us, but fail ourselves as well. And we ask whether or not we want to be judged by those worst moments, or do we want to be judged by the moments where we rise to the occasion? I think for most of us, we want to be judged by the moments in which we rise to the occasion. And what I want is for our immigration law system to do the same thing for migrants. And I think that means removing criminal activity from considerations of who gets to come here and who gets to live here. And I think that will be when we get to that point, I think we will be living in a place that is much fairer toward migrants and much more honest, not only about what migrants contribute, but about what all of us contribute to the United States, and how it may be good in its good moments. We don't live good moments in every instance of every day. That's not because of where we were born. It's because we are, at the end of the day, just fallible, imperfect, ordinary people.
César, thank you for sitting down with me to talk about immigration policing in the United States. That was César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández, law professor at Ohio State University, here on Common Ground with me, Sonja Wolf.
Thank you.